Ahsoka Episode 5 was absolutely insane. Now, the first Star Wars movie I saw in a movie theater was Revenge of the Sith. I was like 7 years old, and for years I'd watched on repeat the original trilogy VHS tapes as well as the first two prequels, but there was always this missing piece that was Revenge of the Sith, and I was so excited to finally get that missing story when that film came out. And I was fortunate enough to be able to get a lot of the toys and the video game, and it was just an awesome time. And Revenge of the Sith and the hype around that movie when it was coming out, it's a core memory for me and just a significant part of my life, and I'm sure it has inspired a lot of my work as a big boy now. And look, while as an adult and a filmmaker, I see the flaws in the prequels. I do, but I just don't care. I still watch Revenge of the Sith all the way through at least once a year, and my entire life is just random Revenge of the Sith quotes that makes my wife want to destroy me, but luckily I'm taller and I always have the high ground. I'm telling you all about my love for Revenge of the Sith because what was this episode of Ahsoka if not a love letter to fans of the prequel movies and series like The Clone Wars? Now, don't get me wrong, I am not a Disney-era Star Wars hater. I love The Force Awakens and Rogue One, the first two Star Wars movies that Disney put out. And I'm also able to acknowledge, unlike some of the franchise's more toxic fans, that beloved shows like The Mandalorian, Andor, and even Ahsoka, but I do want to share a critique I have of those first few years of Star Wars being back under the helm of Disney. During that time, there was basically no acknowledgement of the prequels. They avoided those movies like the plague and anything adjacent to them like the Clone Wars series. I mean, they even put out a Star Wars Battlefront game, the first one since the masterpiece that was the first Star Wars Battlefront 2, and in this new game, there were no prequel characters, no prequel planets, no prequel ships, and it was just obvious that Disney and Lucasfilm felt their best path forward was to ignore the prequels and focus heavily on the original trilogy. And look, I get that. The prequels were not received well by critics and a lot of fans, and Disney understandably thought that their best course of action was to stick to the nostalgic love of the first three films. And look, they were probably right to do that for that time. And don't get me wrong, I adore the original trilogy. It is still by far the best Star Wars has ever been and probably ever will be. But as a guy who grew up with essentially both trilogies side by side, I was able to find a love and respect for both trilogies in their own way. And I think that's the case for a lot of Star Wars fans. So just like the early 2010s was the right time to honor nostalgia of the original trilogy, I think that the early 2020s are proving to be the right time to honor the nostalgia and the love for the prequel era. Now, Ahsoka Tano is a creation of the prequel era. She was created during a pretty dry time for the Star Wars fandom, 3 years after Revenge of the Sith came out, and her entire character was centered in an era of the Star Wars timeline that was controversial at best. And it didn't help that the movie she was introduced in was absolute garbage. Sorry to those of you who liked that movie, all three of you, but yeah, it was a dark time for Star Wars. But then came the Clone Wars series, which, in my personal opinion, had a rough start, but as the series progressed, it turned into a really great piece of Star Wars. A piece of Star Wars that is now being honored in live action. As a prequel fan, I've been begging for some live action prequel era material, and boy, did this episode of Ahsoka deliver. We got to see young Ahsoka in one of her first battles in the Clone Wars with her green lightsaber, and those OG clone troopers, and Hayden Christensen, the GOAT, in his Clone Wars costume, and it put a huge smile on my face. Now, was this extremely fan servicey? Yes, but that's okay. Fan service is okay. Hell, I'd even argue it is necessary as long as it contributes to the story and doesn't feel out of place. And to me, this episode handled that perfectly. In fact, not to complain, but I feel like it could have used a lot more. I mean, if you're gonna do a trippy dream sequence episode with Hayden Christensen back as Anakin, go all out. Show me more than two battles. Show me an alternate future. Show me Ahsoka struggling with her choice to leave the Order, and then Anakin showing her what would have happened had she stayed. Show Ahsoka and Obi-Wan fighting Anakin on Mustafar and maybe killing him, making it to where he died evil instead of redeemed, meaning that the way history actually panned out was the best path possible. Use every tool in your tool belt and drive home that point that everything that happens for a reason and happens because the Force willed it to. Now, I don't want to come off greedy when I say that I wanted more. I want to ask you guys, do you think that this episode went a little too far in some places? Did it not go far enough? Like, what are your overall thoughts on the episode and its incorporation of like some OG prequel stuff and Clone Wars stuff? Dot, I'll throw it to you first.